So welcome everyone to this really, I think, fascinating session on supply chains and their impact on work and on workers. Uh, we all know that supply chains have been an important issue in our field. Globalization, global supply chains and its impact on jobs and so on have always been important. But now it's such a pivotal issue in our field that this session is very, very timely, and I think will be really helpful to help us understand what is happening in supply chains and how it affects work and how it affects workers' efforts to improve their situation. We have a really outstanding panel to discuss this issue, and I'm going to introduce the three panelists right now, and then we'll get right into a discussion. First, we're going to hear from someone who doesn't need an introduction to our LIRA audience, Lisa Lynch. Lisa is a faculty member at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis, but she's also the former provost and acting president of Brandeis. And for us, she's our past president of LIRA and very active in our community and a good colleague. And she's been on a tour of sort of a process of rehabilitation from being provost, spending a year with us again back at her home at MIT and in our group. So we're delighted to welcome her. And later today, as many of you know, we are going to honor Lisa with a Lifetime Achievement Award from LIRA, something that she's certainly earned in many, many ways. Lisa has an extensive public policy background and experience. She was the chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor a number of years ago. She's been active as a member and chair of the board of governors of the Fed Reserve in Boston, and serves in that capacity as an advisor to the New York Fed. And so she brings a national policy, both labor policy and more macroeconomic policy, to bear on these issues, and we'll bring that perspective. Then we are going to hear from Erica Smiley. And I don't know if Erica has solved her computer problems, is with us. If not, I'll say a word about her later. But let me just give you a perspective on Smiley, as we call her, and as she likes to be called. She's the executive director of Jobs with Justice, one of our leading worker advocacy organizations in the United States. It works on public policy issues. It supports a lot of other startup activities in nonprofit ways of organizations that bring new forms of voice to workers. And she's the co-author on a really fascinating book that just came out with Sarita Gupta, her colleague over at the Ford Foundation. And the title of the book is The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. And I recommend this to everyone. It's the most fascinating mix of personal stories, including Sarita's and Smiley's, on struggles to advocate for workers and their experiences, with a good mix of perspectives on how we need to update our institutions and policies to support workers. So Smiley will give us a perspective of how supply chains affect workers and how they affect worker struggles. And third, I want to introduce Roy Bahat to LIRA. And I'm so pleased to introduce Roy. I've gotten to know him quite well over the last year as we work together to try to find new ways to bring about a rebuilding of unions and worker power in ways that work for workers and for the business community in the 21st century. Roy's the head of Bloomberg Beta, a really interesting private equity investment firm that supports startups that commit to building good jobs, including ones that respect worker rights and work with unions and other organizations. And he's out there in the business community as a shining light, really talking to people, advocating, trying to educate, trying to understand how can we build a more positive engagement of labor and business in our society today. So Roy will bring a well-informed business perspective to the issue of supply chains and workers into the discussion. So as we get into this, this is going to be short introductory comments from each of the panelists, and then a broad-based discussion among us and among all of you. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll monitor those and bring you into the conversation. So Lisa, why don't you get us started?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this panel discussion, and I'm thrilled to have on the panel Roy and Smiley. I hope, Smiley, you've been able to manage the computer issues, and Tom, it's great, as always, to be engaged in any dialogue on these issues with you. So I thought that I would be basically the labor economist data nerd and try to set the stage for our policy discussion about supply chains, and begin from yesterday, from our employment report that we received yesterday on the U.S., looking at what happened during the month of May of this year in terms of the job market. So just the headline numbers, the economy, we had 390,000 net new jobs added in the economy. The unemployment rate stayed at 3.6%. We're almost at our historical low of 3.5%. So very strong jobs report. There were sectors that grew, in particular the leisure and hospitality sector. So there was a lot of good news in the report yesterday. For whatever reason, Wall Street took it as bad news, but Main Street and Wall Street don't always go in the same way, as we know. We're still 800,000 jobs below what the labor force was in February 2020, before the pandemic hit so dramatically. And we obviously would have added even more jobs given population growth. But overall, we're at record high labor demand and record low layoffs in the economy. Wages increased by 5.2%, but wages in historically low wage sectors, for example, in leisure and hospitality, increased by close to 12%. So one of the things that's is good to see is that people, especially at the lower end of the wage distribution, are finally getting well-deserved wage increases. And yes, 5.2% is a good wage increase. It's still not keeping pace with inflation, though, that's running at over 8%. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about what's happening in terms of the number of people who are working in the labor market. We're still below, obviously, the number of people that were working back in February of 2020. Some people have talked about a great resignation of people having kind of existential crises and leaving the labor market entirely. I think that's really been somewhat overplayed. I do think we've certainly seen what I might frame as the great retirement for older workers who, as COVID hit, obviously were at much greater risk for COVID, and with stock market and portfolios for those who were fortunate enough to have retirement portfolios. This has actually been a period of time where their wealth was not destroyed as it was during the financial crisis of 2008. But more broadly, we're seeing, signs and indications of what I would call the great renegotiation. So worker bargaining power seems to be increasing. Workers seem to have more power, but that's not evenly distributed across the economy. And I would point in particular to direct care workers. They are really struggling. They're not seeing these 12% wage increases. Nursing home employment is still down almost 400,000 from where it was in February 2020. And even in leisure and hospitality, where we saw a lot of job growth in the last month, it's still down 1.3 million workers. And workers in that sector, again, are, as each wave of COVID comes through, there's a high risk sector. Black and Latinx workers are faring much worse in the labor market. The Black unemployment rate is double the white unemployment rate. And again, we see the educational divide in our economy continues. Now, in terms of our discussion for today, yes, we have a hot labor market with rising wages, but it's interesting to think about what's happened to the part of national income that gets allocated to wages more broadly, the labor share. So historically, about 2/3 of national income went to workers and the rest to owners of capital. But since 2000 in the US, we've seen a dramatic change in labor share, with labor share declining to less than 60%. And there's been some recovery since 2020, but it seems to have leveled off in spite of the hot labor market. So why this sort of dramatic shift in sort of the allocation of, if you will, the benefits of the hard work and productivity of workers, a shift away from workers and towards more towards capital, even at this moment of such a hot labor market. And there's a lot of reasons that have been positive for this, including falling unionization, outsourcing, and the impact of firms' decisions to increase their source of inputs globally. And all of this has put pressure on workers' wages, and unfortunately put downward pressure on their wages. So I'm going to try, let's see if I can do this, share a picture. It's just one chart. And let's see if I can do this, just to sort of show you. Can you see it? Tom, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great.
All good.
So one of the interesting things that has happened, it started in the late 1980s, but really accelerated since 2000, is the amount of global trade that relies on requires inputs from at least two countries. So as you see in this chart, since the mid-1990s, and these are the orange and blue line are just two different ways to sort of measure the amount of these, how much global value chain participation we have worldwide. And I'm not going to get into the details of that. That sort of excites economists, but I think most normal people don't need to really know that. But here we see that it sort of rose steadily. Then when we had the financial crisis of 2008, it dropped off, but then it recovered again, reached a peak in 2018. And so even before COVID, and that's why I want to underscore for our discussion today, even before COVID, there was a slowdown in a pulling back of global value chain participation. So what were some of the reasons for that? Let me just go back and try to get rid of this. See if I can. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen. Here we go, sorry. Well, what were some of the reasons of that? And they're basically three. First was geopolitical. We had the financial crisis of 2008, and in particular, the worsening US-China trade relations that started contributing to a slowdown of the sort of widespread use of these global value chains. Obviously, more recently, with the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, that those geopolitical threats and issues have had an impact on global value chains. There's also been environmental challenges to companies who are thinking of sourcing globally. We had the SARS epidemic of 2003, how quickly we forget about that threat, and increasing numbers of extreme weather events due to climate change that have disrupted transportation and production. For example, the 2011 tsunami in Japan and flooding in Thailand. And obviously we had the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me just talk, since we are, at that unfortunate point of 100 days into the war in Ukraine, both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have highlighted so starkly that global supply chains that supply just-in-time production are much more fragile than people once thought. Reliance on partners who seemed reliable can change depending on the political situation. I think, a good example of that is the relationship between Russia and Germany, with Germany now canceling the Nord Stream 2 Baltic Sea gas pipeline. But, it's not only gas and oil that are at issue right now. We've got, given how the Ukraine is such a major producer of food, especially in grains, sunflower, flour, oil, we're seeing a devastating impact of the collapse of that global supply chain, especially in developing countries that are dependent on these basic food products. But it's not just food and oil. Ukrainian companies account for about half of the world's neon production, which is critical for lasers that are used in chip making. Russia produces about a third of the global palladium supply, a rare metal that's used in sensor chips and certain types of computer memory. So policymakers have been scrambling to respond. Here in the US, we had the passage of the CHIPS Act in 2021, which promises to build chip foundries in the US. And in Europe, they had a similar European CHIPS Act that promises investment in Europe to increase its global capacity share from 9% to 20%. Unfortunately, both in Europe and the United States, these solutions don't address short-term shortages, with added capacity going online no earlier than 2026. So it's a bit of a huge mess. So what are some possible directions for the ways in which companies use global supply chains? Well, one option is that you could hope that the pandemic and the geopolitical concerns go away quickly, and you can just return to as before. I think that's highly unlikely, because we saw, even before COVID-19, even before the war in Ukraine, that companies were starting to pull back. At least, in the data that I showed you that was focusing mainly on manufacturing, we're starting to pull back from such reliance on global supply chains, and sort of a recognition of greater risk than once thought associated with these supply chains. Another option is that you could onshore everything. And while there's been some rhetoric about this, I think that honestly is quite unlikely. There's a lot of value to having these global supply chains. So I think the more likely outcome is that we reshore some production, and then companies will increase the sources of material where they get materials globally to diversify their risk. That's expensive, and memories are short. So they may sort of initially start to reshore, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on companies to go back to the way things, quote unquote, were in the past. And that pressure comes, I think, from two sources. One, obviously, is inflation. With higher inflation and consumers' reluctance to accept higher prices for goods, companies have a great incentive to chase low wages and low production costs around the world. And we have to, recognize that and think about what kinds of carrots can we give companies to not go down that road. And secondly, there's a lot of growth in these global value chains in the non-manufacturing sector and services in non-tangible assets. And this is certainly one of the effects as well of COVID, as everything went so digital. We're now seeing sort of the importance of digital platforms. And that's going to create, I think, incentives for people to be looking offshore for that type of support, not only, but also in things like R&D, product design, brand marketing, and retailing. So, I'm actually at the moment, I'm in Europe for some conferences on economic issues. And I was at a conference earlier in the month where Prime Minister Mario Draghi from Italy spoke quite forcefully about the importance of renegotiating our global trading framework. saying it needs to be updated and redesigned in light of everything that's happening in the global economy. And I would say that as an organization, as LIRA, and all the work that people are doing in this area, when that renegotiation happens, and I do think it will happen, we need to make sure this time around that labor issues are added into the discussion of global trade. And in particular, setting standards for labor working conditions and pay, that has to be a part of this discussion of how we redesign the global trade framework. So with that, I'll stop. And if Smiley has been able to resolve the technical issues, I'll turn to Smiley. Great, terrific.
I'm here. I've been around, and it's always great to hear the economists. And thanks for having me. And it's wonderful to join each of you this morning. And I have to say, I so appreciate the opening landscape from a live economist, because I often will either mock or make fun of economists, and I'm not going to do that. You actually set up the framework really well for me to speak to some key issues that I think are important. So I'll try to be brief, but I'm Southern, so bear with me. The first thing I want to say, I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of organizers and kind of the workers' movement, the labor movement. And I think the first thing that I want to note is that when we think about power and having workers come to the bargaining table as equals with their employer to create like a level playing field for negotiations, it's important to know that power doesn't exactly go away. It shifts, and it has to be organized and uncovered. And I think that this is important in particular, and I'll speak to this in just a moment. If you look at Beverly Silver's framework right out of Johns Hopkins, where she talks about disruptive power or workplace power, the power to stop production, or marketplace power to control labor skills. And what we've seen in this moment is that the pandemic has inadvertently uncovered that many workers who we had perhaps been commonly referring to as low wage have been redefined as essential. And so now there's a discrepancy, and many recognize a discrepancy between understanding that they were essential to the economy, but they were being treated as just disposable. And that was palpable. That was a palpable feeling that we've heard from many, many workers. And they realized that they could expect more, they could demand more. And so then you add to this the rise of the movement for Black Lives after the murder of George Floyd and many others on the top of this kind of can't look away crisis in our democracy. And it created a different level of urgency for most working people. And so, while most economists, I think Linda was much more nuanced than this, so I really appreciated it. A lot of people just chalk it up to a tight labor market. It'll be over soon. Don't worry about it. Businesses, you'll be okay. And certainly it is a tight labor market. It's far more complex than that. I think that, certainly the other thing that's really useful about starting off with the economist perspective is that it can help us understand the growth booms of our current global economy, and kind of how the supply chains have shifted, what the technological boom of so much of the Zoom and digital age has happened in the last couple of years, and what it means for us. And it's really on us as a movement to update our own practices for organizing and collectively bargaining to match those new conditions. And this has always been a problem, or always been something I've been advocating, and my organization's been advocating for the past decade or so. The pandemic sped up the urgency and the need for us to do that. But so many of these multinational brands that workers are lighting up today, right? Like Amazon, Apple, Starbucks, they didn't exist when the National Labor Relations Act was passed. And the framework for them, like the type of operating that they did, didn't exist, other than maybe if you equate Amazon to rail, right? And so it's really important for us to start identifying the new commanding heights or the pressure points and how they will shift given the increase in power of a set of multinational brands and capital on the capital side, and like how we need to organize ourselves to be able to address those from the perspective of organizing. So for example, I mean, again, power doesn't go away, it just moves. So for example, when we think about manufacturing, right, that's obviously now a global thing. It's still a commanding height of the economy, but it has to be organized differently. And I want to share an example in a moment of a recent victory when workers actually did that. When you think about choke points, it used to be that you just stopped an assembly line in an auto plant, and certainly that's still possible to some degree, or at least in this day and age with chips. But there are also data centers that become choke points in the same way that historically we would have thought about work stoppages in manufacturing, right? And then I think for companies like Amazon, right, like, and I wasn't joking when I equated them to the interstate highway or like the continental railway, right? Like if we're looking at a monopoly company where if you are trying to reach your consumer base, you have to ride their highway to get to them. That is a very different type of entity than I think we were dealing with when we were trying to set up a framework for organizing collective bargaining in 1935. So, in our recent book, The Future We Need, Sarita Gupta and I clarified that democracy is not just a system of political practices. It must be applied to participation and decision-making in all aspects of our economic lives as well. Obviously, without one, the whole system will be compromised. And collective bargaining is fundamental to democratizing the economy. And at its best, it's a system in which working people can exercise collective power in a way that directly confronts the owners of capital and in a way that reclaims portions of that capital back to working people in their communities. I wish I could claim that this was our idea. It wasn't. It was the aspiration of many of our ancestors, those who were part of the last great resignation, the last walk-off, or what W.B. Du Bois called the largest strike in American history in the 1860s, when 500,000 formerly enslaved Black workers simply walked away from the plantation agricultural industry that was exploiting them. And radical Reconstruction was marked by attempts to build a multiracial American democracy in all aspects of society. You have the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery and all forms of forced labor. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to those born in the United States. The 15th, which started to define who could vote, and all of these represented efforts to have fully actualized democracy and provided a foundation for later movements to expand on democracy through Civil Rights Act, immigration reform, New Deal, all of which expanded on labor protections in various ways. But, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the 20th century mechanisms that protect collective bargaining have been eroded, even perverted into limitations to the democratic activities of the working majority, often peeling off elements of the working class by race, gender, national origin. So the way we apply collective bargaining must be broadened to all economic relationships and account for the ways in which the economy and workers' experience of it have shifted, ultimately changing the nature of what a union contract covers, broadening what individuals can negotiate over, who they can negotiate with, from their direct boss to the individuals with concentrated power in their sector or in the global economy, the individuals ultimately profiteering from their labor. So our book and our work at Jobs with Justice centers on this, not abandoning the traditional and current framework of collective bargaining, but expanding on it to include these things. And really, so this includes, just to give the quick framework, because I would be remiss if I didn't do this, right? So, one version of that is expanding traditional bargaining, what can be negotiated over in negotiations. This is often called by Kalmanowitz Institute bargaining for the common good, but basically seeing contract negotiations as a site of struggle. The other one is, of course, what I'm going to spend most time in my remarks today and in my comments during the discussion, which is negotiating with the ultimate profiteers of labor and creating like these both ends, not just like you can't just negotiate with your boss, you're also negotiating with your boss's boss and your boss's boss. And then, of course, applying the brilliance of collective bargaining as a democratizing tool for the economy to other economic relationships and community-driven strategies such as housing, debt, banking, you name it. So the key thing I want to make sure I center here before going into the example is that confronting a system of white supremacy and patriarchy has to be a central element of this overall strategy to prevent the opposition from dividing workers and weakening their collective power. That has always been the case. That has always been the case from the historic walkout that I mentioned during Reconstruction to today. And most workers have long been ready to get behind a democracy worth fighting for, but they're more complex. The modern worker is more complex than the strong man holding a pickaxe in a lot of the labor history books. They're whole people with identities and concerns that go far beyond wages. And when unions step up to the challenge of meeting workers where they're at as whole people, and they don't shy away from the centrality of combating white supremacy and gender discrimination, they win, and they win big. So just to get to the specifics, in 2021, Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, mostly Black, 85% Black facility, called for help in their bid to form a union with the RWDSU, Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Sorry, don't mean to stick with the acronyms. Many workers shared how radicalized they were after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota by former police officer Derek Chauvin, having participated in 2020 summer uprisings for racial justice that ultimately gave them the courage to speak out about their own conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then a recent report by a colleague who may or may not be on the call, but I know has been in the conference, by Tammy Lee and Maite at Michigan State University, highlighted the company's disproportionate use of off-duty police to surveil the overwhelmingly Black facility. Now, their 22 union election is still too close to call, which is already in itself a big loss for a company that put billions into preventing unionization, right? And so then just 8 weeks ago, workers in Staten Island, also radicalized by racial injustice after Chris Smalls was arrested and fired in 2020 for demanding better COVID protections and practices, right? After, again, call us essential, you call us into work, but you're not actually treating us like we're essential. They won the first union election at Amazon, right? So in both of these cases, by centering workers' experiences with white supremacy, these fights won where others could not. On the same day as the victory in Staten Island, garment workers on the other side of the planet won the first of its kind agreement with multinational clothing brands, fast fashion brands like H&M. And while union leaders had targeted the companies for years in hopes of winning a stronger wage, many of the union leaders were men, even though the overwhelming majority of garment workers in Asia and Southeast Asia are women. They wanted to organize based on what they perceived as the priority, which was gender-based violence. And so through this lens, and using a bargaining with the ultimate profiteer approach, targeting the multinational brands that purchase the goods they produce, the Tamil Nadu Textile and Common Labor Union, which is a women-led, independent, and majority Dalit trade union, textile workers led this international coalition to support garment workers in ultimately negotiating the Dindigul Agreement, which eliminated gender-based violence and harassment. And what's really great about this, it's an unprecedented agreement because it includes a set of not only is it an enforceable agreement with fast fashion brands like H&M, Gap, Eastman Exports, right? But it covers multiple factories, spilling mills, and it enshrines protections for 5,000 garment workers and provides a model for change within the industry overall, right? Not just even within garment, right? But just within, like when we look at what the global framework agreements have done, what the Bangladesh Accord has done, all of a sudden there's a new model that's an enforceable agreement. And here's the best part. It includes something that we've been fighting for forever, which it puts the burden of proof for retaliation on the company. It's preemptive. So if anyone experiences aggression or retaliation in the plant, it's actually on the company to prove that it wasn't them. And that's not just the multinational brand, but also, of course, the supplier themselves. So here's an example where, again, by centering the fight against gender discrimination, they won where others could not. So instead of leaving the wisdom and power of workers untapped, our task in this moment is to invest in and elevate the creative efforts to imagine a multiracial democracy, politically and economically, that works for all of us. So workers are already in motion. And as we think about what this means for shaping a new social compact, I feel like our task is to respond to the following question. And I'm going to try to close my piece out with this at least. So this has been my agitating question, at least when I get either discouraged or I'm frustrated or whatever. So, if the exodus of 500,000 enslaved Black workers was to radical reconstruction, what the uprisings in manufacturing industries such as auto and mining were to the New Deal, or what the entry of women and Black workers into the public sector was to the Civil Rights Act, then the current upsurge of workers at Amazon, Starbucks, Apple, H&M, The Gap, all these other companies, that the current upsurge of workers, the great awakening that we're experiencing now, will be to what 10 to 20 years from now? Which of us will be the Francis Perkins among us to imagine a new legal framework to protect workers based on the current relations of power and not simply the power dynamics of 1935? Which of us will design a 21st century framework for global industrial bargaining, for sectoral bargaining, for market-based strategies, and more? Who will lead the charge for global and national industrial relations agencies to mediate between workers and large corporations? I was in this meeting in New York a few weeks ago. Don't ask me how I got there, how I was invited into this room, but it was with a lot of the state treasurers and some of the big city treasurers. And they were having a conversation. We're talking about Amazon. And one of them just flat out asked me, like, with all the different organizations and unions that are trying to organize workers at Amazon, what is it, what would bargaining look like? What would it even mean for Amazon workers to negotiate with the company? And I said, I don't know. Which of you is going to help us figure out a framework that makes it work? Which of you is going to look at this and create some kind of new national or industrial relations council to figure it out with us? This is a moment I feel, and I was just actually cheekily joking with Roy about this, right? I feel like this is a moment where we are on the precipice of something big. And we have to think about, even before the great walk-off that W.B. Du Bois refers to. I like to sometimes even go all the way back to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And I have to think, like, when I'm really discouraged, when I'm really frustrated, and I can't, for whatever reason, turn off cable news, and I hear all the things that are against us, the mountains we have to climb in order to accomplish this great dream of a multiracial democracy. I like to think of what my ancestors in 1850, during the era of the Fugitive Slave Act, were thinking. We live in the future. We know that they overcame. We know that it was followed by a walkout. They didn't know at that time in 1850. And yet the actions and the campaigns, stealth and public, that they were taking ultimately led to not only the Civil War, but of course, Reconstruction and kind of redefining, refounding the country in a way that was pointing in the direction of a multiracial democracy. And so if any of us get discouraged, I do want us to try to think through, what does it mean in this moment to have a radical imagination for building a bargaining framework, not just because we want workers' rights, because I think workers are in motion right now, not just because they think they want workers' rights or they've been mobilized by a workers' rights movement. I think a lot of people are in motion because they think they have to do something to help us save and salvage the dream for a multiracial democracy. And like Big Mike said in Bessemer, Alabama, for him, that fight was on the shop floor.
Good. Well, thank you, Smiley. This is a really call to arms to figure out that new framework, and your book will really help us get there. So, Roy, let's turn to you.
Well, thank you. And Smiley, I think, if we need a new Francis Perkins, we could do worse than Smiley. The perspective I want to offer is a narrow one, which is, everyone, to me, every thinking person who hears the kind of data that Lisa laid out and the kind of perspective that Smiley laid out would say, we obviously need this to change in order to have a functional economy and society. And business leaders traditionally, well, I say for the last few decades, have heard that and sort of said, yes, 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 but maybe government should do something, or maybe people should work harder, or maybe something. And what they haven't said is, wait a minute, all of us as citizens, most importantly, or members of this society, and for business leaders, as leaders of modern corporations, are also imperiled by all of this. And so I come here as a person whose occupation is investing in technology startups, including in the logistics and supply chain industry, to say that my perspective is, we as business leaders also need to fix this. And so the way I tend to think about it is from the perspective of how, is for the changes that Lisa and Smiley are describing, how might we get there? And I think about this moment in the supply chain industry as a moment of leverage for working people. And the truth is, many businesses that want to change the system also struggle because they're just participants in a long value chain, and making a change as one company or even one industry isn't always straightforward to do when you're embedded in a system where you have competitive challenges or a culture of working in a certain way among your workforce. And so I look for what are the opportunities that are presented by this moment. And I believe that workers correctly are sensing that they have more leverage right now, not only because of, setting aside the last month or so of turmoil in the markets, a moment of prosperity in business where business can, of course, afford to do more, not only in a tight labor market where workers, especially workers who have skills that are very difficult to replace, like those who work in the logistics industry, have more leverage, but specifically with supply chain, when companies are struggling to deliver goods on time to the customers who they serve, when uncertainty begins to reign, not just on price, but on whether you can get, not just your book you might have wanted, but baby formula, then that moment of customer dissatisfaction creates enormous leverage. The last factor at the moment is that we have a moment of generational turnover happening in the leadership of industry. And, forgive me, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I'm a technology startup investor, and so I tend to see the role of technology in all of this. But the tenure of American corporations at the top of their industry used to be much longer. If you look at, I haven't done this analysis in a few years, but I'm confident it's even more true now. If you look at who is in the Fortune 500, the average number of years that a company is in the Fortune 500, the top 500 businesses in the US, or global businesses as rated by a US publication, continues to go down. And that means that new leadership will come to the fore with greater frequency. And company leadership tends to no longer be a case of, as frequently, of I rise in the ranks and eventually take over this company as a hired employee, but by that point I've been steeped in the way this company operates for decades, and more a question of, no, the leadership is just replaced by a new company coming along. And I've seen this firsthand in the logistics industry because we're investors in a company that is a freight forwarder, meaning they're the company that if you are an importer of goods, if you want to sell your electronic product in the US and you need to get components or the finished product to come in from China, you call up a freight broker. And you say, hey, I need such and such number of containers delivered. And then they go out and fan out to all of the asset owners, the companies that have boats or planes, and get you the goods. And that is an industry that has traditionally been done in pen and paper by people whose expertise traditionally has been how to work complicated and sometimes crooked systems. Oh, I'll call that guy in customs and figure out where your container is. And now that's turning into software, meaning it's now turning into a place where instead of calling somebody and saying, hey, where is that shipping container? And I saw this, by the way, I started a consumer electronics company. And when we wanted to figure out where our goods that we had paid millions of dollars to purchase were and when they would arrive, we'd ask some guy who'd call his 3 buddies, and 2 days later they'd call back and he'd tell us, well, it'll be here in 2 to 4 weeks or something like that. It's somewhere in the ocean. And now like we're commonly adjusted to as consumers, you can now just look at it and see it on a map, on a screen somewhere. And that transparency and that modernity creates a culture of willingness to examine things from first principles. And if we can turn that culture and willingness to something it has not yet been turned to, which is a willingness to examine from first principles the way the relationship ought to work between business and organized labor, then I think there is an opportunity to invent and create some new paradigms. I think there are many win-win opportunities here. When I look at who is negotiating with the what did you call it, Smiley? The ultimate profiteer. Negotiating with the ultimate profiteers in many of these cases, I think will say, I could see a way that more unionization, more organized labor might be good for my long-term self-interests. Now, we have a lot of work to do to both make that case credibly and to have it land, because we have decades of training in business, as Tom knows firsthand, where the orthodoxy has trained business leaders to think of unions as a tax, to think of unions as a regulation, to think of unions as red tape. And I believe, well, I'll share some of the work that Tom and Wilma and I have been doing, which is, we've been organizing business leaders who want to be labor open and informing them about the facts of how unions can work, and just creating a safe space where they can relate to one another in such a way that they can try to be inventive. And I don't mean to be a Pollyanna here and say, oh, there's of course win-win solutions for everybody, because that's nonsense. Plenty of the victories that workers deserve will have to come at the expense of shareholders and other stakeholders. But that doesn't mean that we can't invent many ways this can work much better. And it means that we need to try less adversarial relationships, which the new generation of company leaders has an opportunity to begin to practice. And we have to acknowledge that some of their objections about unions are completely valid. The fact that some unions fail to serve the best performing employees and are seen by those employees as protection for the worst performing employees, that some work rules constrain the ability of companies to be as nimble as they could otherwise be, that the history in the US has not been that when unionization arrives in an industry, that industry thrives. And the industries need to thrive for them to continue to exist and therefore support the healthier worker outcomes that our economy and society need. And so, my theory of change here is relatively narrow. It's that if workers can take advantage of this moment of leverage, which comes not just from the tight labor market, but from the changing expectations of consumers, from the generational turnover in leadership, and can sit down with organized labor in ways that are different than the traditional template. Every time somebody in the union movement says to me, labor knows what to do, just let us do it, labor knows what to do, I think to myself, this has to be nonsense, because if labor knew what to do, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. And so just blaming it all on changes in labor law, I think is a mistake. If we can sit down and do that, could we have a new Treaty of Detroit? What might that look like to have a different government labor business relationship? I think that is the question of the next, of the next 20 years for us. And I hope it won't take us 20 years to solve it, but that's the work that we're trying to do. We have this group called the Aspen Business Roundtable on Organized Labor, which is something we've just begun talking about in public, which is under the shingle of the Aspen Institute, basically a small, safe space for business leaders who want to reinvent the template to gather and work. Supply chain and logistics are an essential element of that because of how they drive the rest of the economy and for all the reasons that Smiley and Lisa gave. And I, as a business leader, consider myself still very new to this and still learning. And so I'm here, and this is now my second LIRA event, and I've been delighted to do them because I'm here to gain a perspective that can help me to be savvier about all this so that I can provide some support and guidance for other business leaders who want to do the same. So that's my brief take on the whole thing, and happy to answer any and all questions and engage in the conversation.
Well, thank you, Roy, and thank you, Lisa and Smiley. What a great panel. And you raised so many issues. And now let's just have a little back and forth. And there's a question from Steve Greenhouse I'm going to get to in a moment. But first, your comments really triggered for me the thought that, yes, we need a new public policy framework. We need a new practice framework. The question is, can we get some experiments? We're not going to get the policy change until we document and demonstrate the possibilities. So where would you see some opportunities as organizations maybe reshore, Ford is now going to build more electric vehicles here and add jobs. What kind of experiments would you like to see if we could find some organizations to step up to the case? And I have to also negotiate a little bit. I know we are due to finish at noon, or at I'm not noon, at 11 o'clock. But we might bargain for a few minutes after that with our good organizers, if that's possible, because this is just too rich a discussion. Okay, good. So folks, there is another session at 11:15, but we might be able to stay for a few minutes on our own. Good. So let me put it back to the panel. And Smiley, you raised it, so I'm going to ask you first, but then Lisa and Roy to jump in. What kind of experiment and how can we get that to happen so we've got some evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is happening. So I want to both respond a little bit to Stephen's question in the chat, as well as what you just laid out, Tom. And that is that, so let's imagine, for example, because we have like the supply chain, and then there's also like the labor migration chain or the labor supply chain, right? And so one of the amazing things that the Dindigul Agreement accomplished in Asia is that, you know, it came out of and was supported deeply by this group that's been around for 20 years called the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, right? And the theory there is to try to reorganize garment employment and garment wage fights globally, or at least regionally, so that it's not as easy to just like go across borders to like buy new things and buy different things. And they've had some success, you know, both in terms of negotiating or setting a calculator for how to define that wage, but also in trying to approach multinational brands to pay, say, like a bonus wage or a wage on top of what the country's minimum wage is in order to meet the Asia floor wage. I mean, so now in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, which is, you know, certainly far more similar to low wage work in Asia and other places than it is to, say, Western Europe, right? They're trying a very similar model across Georgia, Bulgaria, some of these countries in Eastern Europe. And so, you know, it would be really interesting to me to imagine what a modern North American free trade agreement or fair trade agreement would look like, that included stipulations and standards along the migration corridors, that included a floor wage, and maybe a North American floor wage, or a set of health and safety standards, or a set of like regulations against retaliation, kind of a migration chain version of just cause. So you can't just send someone home without proving just cause, right? Like there are different ways that I feel like we could test it. The second thing I just want to say, and I think the last thing, and then I want to hear from Roy and Lisa, is that I think that we, you know, a lot of times when people talk about these ideas, or when I talk about these theories of bargaining with the ultimate profiteer, or like sectoral strategies and sectoral bargaining for the common good, which we had that article with Joe McCartan, which was fantastic. Yeah. I think that it's still very theorized, and people are like, okay, well, the examples are all from these other places, and like, what does it mean for us? But the truth is, we actually have a lot of homegrown examples just here in the States that we don't pay attention to, both historically and current. I mean, I was joking because the DeMaurice Smith, the president of the NFL Players Association, wrote the foreword for our book. And as we were talking, I was joking. I was like, yeah, I was just looking at you guys' contract. It's kind of like a sectoral agreement, right? Like you negotiate it with the league, and then all the franchises, all the teams like adhere to it. And he's like, yeah, it is. It's not, like he said, he was like nonchalant. He's like, I thought you knew. Like, am I the first person telling you this? And I was like, yeah. You know, I mean, everyone talks about McDonald's and fast food, like we have to go to Europe and find all these models, but it's like right here, like we have it and it's working perfectly fine. And so I just think that I think it's important for us, Tom, to trust in the creativity of our own people, and to trust in the creativity of workers to make the road by walking. So they may not set up the new, you know, federal or industrial framework for bargaining, but they're going to show you what the need is. And so the key for us is to then define a system around.
That's right. That's right. Listen and watch what workers are trying to do.
Lisa, yeah, let me just jump in here because I think, Tom, I wouldn't ever use this. I wouldn't frame it as let's find some places where we can do some experiments. I think as Smiley, you know, the work that you know, Smiley, that you and your colleagues do, I think we are not putting the spotlight on places where organizing is happening, and we're still thinking about organizing in a traditional sense. And there's just so much that's going on. I mean, I want to put props out to the folks at Cornell who are doing the strike activity indicator project, because they're not just looking at traditional strikes that are happening within, the National Labor Relations Act. They're looking at all kinds of different types of demonstrations, people coming together, even if they're not unionized, protesting about, obviously with COVID, the extreme health and safety issues that people were facing. And when you look at the Cornell data, you see that across different sectors. So you see this common issue that is shared with just so many people. So yeah. I think rather than thinking about experiments, we know a lot of what works well. I would push instead, that's why I made my comment about, as people think about changing the framework, for example, for, the World Trade Organization. I mean, the fact that labor wasn't included, it's just absurd. So who the hell do they think are making all of these clothes and items, and to sort of pretend, well, we don't need to get ourselves involved with that. That is just a huge mistake. Even, the wonderful stuff that's happening in the garment industry, when I was back in the mid 90s working on, trying to address sweatshops, we were very much focused on companies and trying to get company CEOs to change their policies, but we were not focused on empowering workers, and you need both. You have to have both. And an organization like Lear that's bringing these people together, if you don't have both sides, it's just not going to work.
That's great. And Lisa, let me just put in a little plug. Next Wednesday, we will release a new report that looks at the full range of organizing activities, both traditional within the unions and all of the worker advocacy organizations. And the idea is to put that out with a network of us who are working on these issues to have a national public discussion of these issues. So you're exactly right. There's so much experimentation going on up there. We just have to continue it. Roy, and we do have official dispensation. We have a firm ending point though at 10 minutes after the hour, so that people can go to the PhD consortium and some other things. But we'll keep the dialogue going for those of you who can stay. Roy, you're muted, Roy.
Naturally, the tech guy can never unmute himself. Instead of taking the liberty of answering that question with just chiming in on something else, let me ask, what do you think, Tom, is most constructive for us in terms of what issues we want to hit while we have 10 more minutes?
Well, I think this issue of how do we expand the scope of bargaining to get at the issues? How do we create a new bargain, a grand bargain, whether we call it a new social contract, a new Treaty of Detroit, where we really do respect worker rights, but that we open up for innovation. I think that's the I'll offer some thoughts on that. And Tom, let me ask, just given the Sloan School, Wilma and I were just writing about this, who was on the other side of the table from Walter Reuther and the Treaty of Detroit? Was it Alfred Sloan, or was it No, it wasn't Alfred Sloan directly. It was his director of labor relations at GM. I've forgotten the name.
Okay,
but there's a famous handshake, and
but Alfred Sloan was ultimately the CEO of the company at that time.
He was still there.
Yeah.
And also so
from like the way I think about this, sorry, Smiley.
I said in opposition from Mitt Romney's dad.
Yeah, right. The way I think about this is not so much what are the best ideas for experiments, although I won't dodge the question and I'll offer some of mine in a second. I've noticed even in this panel and in this discussion, we often use the word we in an ambiguous way, which is to say, when we say sentences like we need to have labor at the table, who is the we that we are talking about there? Whose ideas should this be? And I just want to interrogate that a little bit, because I think the answer must be that I, as a business leader, can bring ideas for what business ought to do. When it comes to the ideas for what we as a society ought to do, or what labor might want, I feel like I could speculate. As a citizen, I can certainly speak for what I want in the society, but I think that the question to me starts with who we are including as leaders and who represent one sector or another in our invitation to converse. And I think we have not heard enough of the ideas directly, in part from labor, in part because labor organizations haven't been as prevalent as they should be. And so it's not clear always who to ask. And now workers, that said, are speaking loudly in 1,000 other ways. And, to the question in the chat about, how do we feel about the fact that a lot of them were voting for Trump? Well, that's one way in which they were speaking. I mean, my own path to organized labor and my interest in that began when I saw the extreme, not began because it always been sitting there, but accelerated when I saw the way that workers were rationally saying, I just desperately need a change. And if that crazy sexually assaultive man is the only way out and I have to, wince and vote for him, well, then I'm going to do that. And obviously that didn't work, or at least obviously to me, that didn't work. And I was one of these people who, when Trump had his inauguration speech, I thought maybe he's not going to be as awful. He started talking about building, not inauguration, sorry, with his election night speech, because the inauguration speech was about American carnage. The election night speech, when he won, he said, we need to build infrastructure. I was like, wait a minute, maybe now he'll be sane. But no, obviously that didn't happen. And so, working people are looking to labor organizations. And in my home industry of technology, and again, I'll get to the specific experiments in one second, my home industry of technology, we're seeing that the mix of issues workers care about is quite different from the caricature. They care about issues like, what is the social stance of my company? Am I proud to work here? Of course, for the ones who need to care about wages, because their wages are not, not the professional class workers, they care about wages, they care about working conditions, they care about dignity and security. But I think what we really need is a process where we hear about it. And so my suggestion on that, as a corporate leader, and this is one of the areas where Wilma and I have spoken a bunch, is about what the law currently allows, even if we have to, to stretch and do some things that the law were to be more explicit about in the future. I think about, how do we get workers to have decision-making power over different elements of business decision-making? And so I look at things like the New York Times union, which my understanding is runs healthcare benefits, and that may happen in plenty of other places. And you look at that at every layer of the corporate stack. So let's just go up to the top of the corporate stack, which is the board of directors representing shareholders. Worker elected members of boards of directors, even, and shoot me for saying this, even versions that look like what was in the TEAM Act, I think would be quite constructive, potentially. Certainly Elizabeth Warren's proposed legislation put that front and center. And a lot of people in the union movement say, oh, what's one vote? They don't have control. What's one seat without a vote? As a person who's been in many boardrooms, I can tell you, any one person who is in the room has enormous power, because you can't ignore their perspective, because they have agenda shaping power. And so even somebody who has no vote or one vote, who represents a constituency that isn't there, can be enormously powerful. And this gets to Starbucks. And I realize we're off the supply chain topic a little bit, but just to bring it up for Starbucks for a hot second, Starbucks has this idea that they have 2 empty chairs in their boardroom to represent baristas. And as a Jewish person, that reminds me of the prophet Elijah at the Passover Seder. But of course, why is the prophet Elijah not there? Because the prophet Elijah can't be there. But you can have an actual elected representative of a barista in the room. And the New York Times article on this, or maybe it's the Business Week, the Josh Idelson article, although Noam Scheiber has done some great coverage of this as well. And obviously Stephen, years and years of past coverage. They described that moment of discussion of where the workers said, hey, isn't this, you have these people, these empty chairs, why don't you just fill them? And the Starbucks person reportedly said, haven't you ever heard of a metaphor? And it's like, yeah, we use metaphors when we can't get the real thing, but we can get the real thing here. And so in a tiny little green shoot, and as a startup person, I am trained to look for these little tiny green shoots and then focus my attention on nurturing them. There is a small technology company called Honeycomb that does a technology infrastructure service that, if I described to you what it was, we'd use the rest of our time, that has a 1-year experiment that has barely been reported on to have a worker elected board representative. And the head of that is going to speak at a Fortune conference. By the way, Tom, Wednesday, you release your report. And later that day, as you know, I'm going to be speaking at the Bloomberg Technology Conference about what technology executives need to know about organized labor. Well, what they need to know is that people are trying things. and that if they work, they can, and the companies become wildly successful, they can be powerful. And so that is an experiment I'm looking at, is how do we get worker elected representation at different levels of the stack? And thank you, Stephen, for knowing the facts on those, on the different formats of it. And I have two kinds of problems that I think about in the business world: ice cream problems and mushroom problems. An ice cream problem is it doesn't matter what flavor you get, it's good no matter what. A mushroom problem is different flavors of it could kill you. Something like guaranteed income, I've worked on a lot. That's a mushroom problem. The different flavors of it, some could be great and some could be terrible. Worker elected representation on boards is an ice cream problem. Give me any form of representation, and it's something I think we can work with. So, end of rant.
Well, let it be known that we can now proclaim that here at LIRA today, we have called for the next generation set of experiments that are underway, new models of labor management relationship that respect worker rights and engage workers in new ways, as well as fixing the problems with our labor law so that real collective bargaining can happen without such a fear of retaliation, and that it's time for this new national bargain. And maybe we are launching that here as we go forward. We've got 3 minutes. So I'm going to ask, and there are some great questions in the chat, really questions. If you were an advisor to the Biden administration, what would you do about these issues? But I'm going to just ask you to give your free-flowing comments to wrap up in maybe 30 seconds each. And Lisa, we'll start with you and go from there.
Well, I just want to add, we've had experiments in the past. I would say in particular in the manufacturing sector, where we've had labor and management sitting down together, doing joint problem solving, having workers involved in decision making. And it's something that I sort of extensively documented the positive impact that had on both profitability and productivity and wages for workers. But I think that the ugly truth that we have to always recognize is that companies can make money going the high road, and companies can make money going the low road. So that's where I think, the policies that we have in place, the frameworks that we have in place, push you, in one direction or another, but without any sort of structure that, leads companies to what, in the past we called the high road. You can make money not being such a good guy.
Thank you, Lisa. Good. Smiley.
I put a lot of my comments in the chat, so I will try to be just really short on Bill's question. I think that I would advise the Biden administration to go for broke, and I'll say it like this: like, I wouldn't be here if many of my ancestors hadn't broken bad laws. And so stop just trying to follow the rule book on everything, like create dislocated worker funds for workers fired for organizing, make it a real penalty for the company so that workers are now like organizing even more when they're laid off, or cancel contracts with companies with live labor disputes. I mean, there are just a whole bunch of basic things they can do. And who cares who gets criticized? Stop trying to be bipartisan. Just get in there and actually start shaking things up, because I actually think that will speak to some of the voters who are just fed up. And I mentioned the new map in the chat, and I'll just leave with this last story, which is that in West Virginia, we, after the teachers' actions in the last big teacher walkouts 2018, I got a chance, and we have this story in our book to talk to a lot of folks. And a couple of, one of the things that really stuck out to me is that the 3 counties where teachers walked out first and were literally like escorted through a blizzard by bus drivers to get to Charleston were the bottom 3 counties: Mingo, Wyoming, right? These are like and if you look at a political map, they are the reddest counties. They're so pro-Trump. They don't even like Manchin, who I would argue is not a bastion of progressivism, right? And so they are super red. So if you look at the lens through a political map, you would have never predicted that. You would have assumed it would have been, Monongalia and Marion and like the center counties. And so I think it's really important for us in this moment to think about the map of the country, at least through the lens of how recently they had access to 20th century democracy, if ever at all, and use that as a lens through which they have an appetite for something new. Because those who have it, like particularly in the South, who've long lost if they ever had access, are here to go for broke. They're going to break everything to try to create something that actually works. Right now, the right is trying to put themselves in that position. Rubio's all about let's make the Republicans the class of the party of the multiracial working class. We can't allow that to happen. And so if I were advising the Biden administration and anyone else, I would actually say, like, you have to break some things in order to regain the trust of people who actually need to see their future in us.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Roy?
Smiley for president. It's right there in the chat. I'm just repeating. As a startup person, I also agree that you often have to work outside the framework of what is obviously permissible. And that can be awful, but it can also be wonderful and necessary. And so we got to try. And what I'll just say is I consider myself, despite years of having worked on this, at the beginning of my own journey. And so I'm going to put my email here in the chat. If any, what I often say to tech audiences is I'm very easy to find on the internet. If you can't find me, get a new job, but that's if you work in the technology industry. So for everybody else, I'll make it a half step easier. And we're just going to have to figure this out together. There is if we get this right, then 50 years from now, folks will look back on this moment and say the crisis forced them to create. It forced them to do things in new ways and rebalance the table. And it might as well be us because nobody else is talking about it. So, I'm just grateful to all of you. And Tom, you've been, as is your occupation, you, Wilma, others, Smiley, now Lisa, I can learn from you, wonderful teachers along the way. And let's go learn and try some things that feel incredibly uncomfortable to all of us.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful wrap up from everyone. And let me just say, and Lisa and I have been at a lot of LYRA activities. I think this is the most energizing. This recording is something that we can now take nationally and internationally, because the voices of the three of you have articulated what so many of us believe needs to happen and what really will build the new democracy that Smiley and Sarita write about so eloquently in their book, and that we're all working towards. So thank you for contributing to this. Thank you to the audience. There are wonderful lists of chats here, questions, comments, engagement. This is the best of LYRA. Thank you all, and have a good conference this afternoon. Well, gang, you did it. You were just fantastic, and the fact that we had just about everyone stay on and after the deadline, and obviously they now have to go on to other things, is a real tribute to the quality of your comments, to the energy, to the importance of the issues, and I believe we should do something with this recording, maybe edit it a bit in some way, because I think it's what you all said is so powerful. So we'll give some thought to that. But there are a lot of things going on Thursday next week. New York Times Deal Book is holding a conference in Washington with about 8 of us on a panel where we're supposed to come up with a new social contract in 2 hours. And then they're going to present it to some folks. But the time is, that's just an illustration. The time is right. Everybody wants to talk about it. We've got the attention of the labor beat that Steve has written about, and that all kinds of good people are out there. So I think we just have to take these issues to the American public and move forward. So thank you. Keep at it.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
All right.
Thank you for
Thank you,
organizing
Roy.
this.
Thank you, Smiley.
Yeah, Lisa, Smiley, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm, Smiley, you may want some rest, but the Smiley for President campaign, we're just going to be able to say, and it started here.
That's right. There we go. There we go.
No,
and one of our colleagues said this presentation should be shared with the local chapters of LYRA, which gets it out to, I don't know now, 60 or whatever the number of.
That's a great suggestion from Don.
Yeah. Good.